Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Now, when people think of the word jazz, many will think of its origins in the 20s and even in the decade before. Some will trace it back to things like ragtime and blues, two genres that predated it, especially ragtime. Others will think of the swing era of the 1930s and early 1940s when big bands ruled. Others yet will think of the ultra cool jazz combos of the late 40s and 50s, the golden age of bebop, while others will think of the still all acoustic hard bop and modal eras of the late 50s and early 60s. But for me, it was in the late 60s and 70s when jazz was at its most diverse, because you had many different styles of music, all purporting to be jazz and all being played by a similar large family of musicians. But you had things that were emerging that were very distinct. You had free jazz, avant-garde jazz, Afro jazz fusion, jazz rock fusion, jazz funk fusion, all sorts of electric and experimental jazz. And I think it is fair to say that it was in the 70s when jazz got the loudest because amplified instruments entered into things. Large drum sets became very prominent. And as a result, it became very dynamic. New instruments were introduced, whether from non-American, non-European cultures. So Afro-Asiatic instruments were introduced, as were the latest and greatest synthesizers. And in the 70s, there was something for everyone in jazz, and artists like George Benson and the Mahavishnu Orchestra with John McLaughlin, Chick Corea and Return to Forever, Weather Report with Wayne Shorter and Joe Zawinul, and many of the individual artists associated with these groups, they sold big. Keith Jarrett sold big. Miles Davis continued to sell big. And it was really an overlooked golden age of all things jazz. And what it also proved is that what's in a name? The name jazz really became a moniker for anything that was somewhat improvisational, somewhat instrumental, somewhat rooted in Black American music, although it could really be rooted in anything by the 70s. And it could be smooth and funky like a Hubert Laws record. It could be loud and electric like a Mahavishnu recording. It could be very improvisational like Keith Jarrett. It could be syncretic that draws from Latin and European and Afro-American influences like Chick Corea. It can be funky like Herbie Hancock. It can be so many things. But what happened to jazz in the 80s? Well, as a name, it remained very popular. But as a genre, it became incredibly emerged and some would even say submerged into the world of pop. The jazz fusion of the late 70s and early 80s became increasingly dominated by pop production sensibilities, which is something that you certainly cannot say about your Weather Reports, Return to Forever's, Herbie's Headhunters, or Mahavishnu Orchestra. But once you get into someone who was a pop artist, Herb Alpert, doing a sort of funky, somewhat jazzy album Rise in 1978 that was hugely popular, you continue to see a lot of bands with a similar production style who, yes, were virtuosic, but whose production was definitely aiming for something tighter, more sort of middle of the road in terms of dynamics and very polished. And you had bands like Spyro Gyra, you had bands like the Yellow Jackets, you had David Sanborn reinventing himself as a pop jazz fusion artist as opposed to a traditional jazz fusion artist. And even many of the sensibilities of both pop music and electro-funk crept into jazz. People like Marcus Miller and Miles Davis were using things like Simmons drums and sequencers on their records, and the same synthesizers that, again, were being used on the pop charts. And so while all of the people I named were virtuosos, the level of virtuosity did not change. What changed was the production sensibility. Now, with all of this, there was still really highly improvisational and ultra virtuosic stuff going on. Take, for instance, the Chick Corea Electric Band. But there too, the production sensibility, that very 80s style drum sound, which even sometimes included some Simmons pads, the modern digital synthesizers of the late 80s, that very dry yet prominent mid-rangey bass sound of the 80s. And so did jazz change in the 80s? Well, yeah, jazz, like all music, but particularly instrumental music, it's always evolving. But what changed the most was the production style. And insofar as it did, the aim was to make the song, the sound, the sonic palette of jazz more appealing to the person conditioned by danceable and jazz influenced pop music. And by the end of the decade, this had evolved, or some would say devolved, into something much more mushy than anything Miles or Spyro Gyra or the Yellow Jackets or Chick Corea was doing, all of which retained a level of extreme virtuosity. And it devolved into the late 80s, mid to late 80s smooth jazz scene, which was really Kenny G was emblematic of that. And that made no bones about it. It was pop music, but played with pop music production, but featuring instrumentals played by musicians who had a jazz background. And in all of this, there was a neo-traditionalist revival led by people like Wynton Marsalis. It was an interesting decade for jazz, not as explosive as the 70s was, but interesting nevertheless. Let me know what you think. Is jazz still around? Can it ever die? Will it outlast rock and roll? In some ways, it has. We will talk about that on a future video. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.